All right, welcome to the Europe and Russia Primes class notes. Make sure you give these a page number, put them in your table of contents, your notebook, and give them a date. First prime is political, talk about types of governments, historically and modern. Important to remember that Europe is the birthplace of many modern political ideas. The ideas that classical Greece and Rome, things like direct democracy and representative democracy, are the foundations of our government here. Also, important thinkers come out of Europe later on in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s. Guys like John Locke, Count de Montesquieu, and Voltaire. All of these guys have tremendous influence, all from Europe, and all tremendous influence on our own modern political ideas. Just look at some of the types of governments we see throughout Europe. One type that I'm going to talk about here is called the constitutional monarchy. In a constitutional monarchy, the head of state is a king or a queen, someone who's born into that position, but they have limited power, and that power is limited by an elected body of people and laws. The most popular type of government is parliamentary democracy. It's the most popular in the world and definitely most popular in Europe. It was sort of modeled first in England and then spread around the world. In a parliamentary democracy, the people don't vote for the head of state like we vote for our president. Instead, the people vote for their representatives. And once all the representatives get together, they vote for that leader. And that leader is called the prime minister. So the people don't vote for the head of state, the actual representatives do. Example of a prime minister is Angela Merkel. She's the prime minister. In Germany, they call her chancellor. She was elected back in 2006. She's the first woman chancellor of Germany. Second woman to head the G8 Council. The G8 is a council of 8 of the richest nations in the world, and she leads a coalition government, meaning multiple parties working together to get all their party platforms put together. She's been hailed as a pretty popular leader in Germany, major player in the world. She's done great things for the German economy, and she is very popular again for her high approval ratings for handling what's going on right now in Europe with the Euro crisis. A former country is the Soviet Union. It's not around anymore. The Soviet Union was established in 1922. It used to be run by an absolute monarch called the Tsar, but in the 1920s, a group of communists who felt that they would be better represented by a different type of government violently overthrew that monarch and established what's called a single-party state, which means that it's only one political party. Only members of one political party are allowed to participate in government, and those, of course, were the Soviet Communist Party. So they're going to run, the Soviet Communist parties are going to run the USSR, the Soviet Union, from the 1920s right up until 1991. That's when the Cold War, quote unquote, officially ends. And this is because the Soviet Union begins to collapse due to some social unrest. People are unhappy with the communist system. People wanted more freedom. People wanted to be able to buy and sell more things. And some economic problems. Basically, trying to compete with the United States is very expensive. So with the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union breaks up and becomes Russia, and then 14 other new, what we call nation states. The current president of Russia is Vladimir Putin. Now, Vladimir Putin has been president 2 different times. He was Russia's second president and their 4th president. He went first in 2000 to 2008, served 2 terms, took 4 years off, and was re-elected in 2012, and is currently the current president of Russia. During that time, during between presidencies, he remained a very powerful player in Russia. He sort of handpicked the guy who was supposed to be his successor, and then when his successor served 1 term, that guy stepped down and allowed Vladimir Putin to run again. So even though Vladimir Putin wasn't technically president, he's the real power player. He's the guy pulling the strings the whole time. So although he had a 4-year break, technically being president, it's important to remember that it's really he's been in power continuously since 2000, which is not really how it's supposed to be. What Russian democracy looks like is not what we would call true, honest, and transparent democracy. He's former KGB. The KGB was the Soviet Union's CIA. When he came to power in Russia, it was a mess. He brought a lot of economic and political stability to Russia. He did so by concentrating most of that power on himself, his office. So he gave himself almost dictatorial power, and which again is not really how it's supposed to work out. But because he brought order, he's overall very popular in Russia. Despite the fact that around the world he's criticized for being sort of a dictator, and he's practiced a pretty harsh foreign policy. Various wars he's fought against former Soviet republics and other breakaway territories. How he's handled issues in Syria and in Darfur. He is, again, a very powerful world player. Moving on to our next section of religion. So historically, Europe and Russia together most have been Christian, except during the Soviet era. In that point, Russia, no religion was allowed. Communism doesn't believe in the existence of religion. They taught atheism, so the lack of belief in God. Today, Christianity is allowed to flourish again in Russia. They practice a branch called Eastern Orthodox Christianity. You do have Muslims also in Europe, mostly in the Caucasus regions down in southern Russia, but you also have pockets of them in southeast Europe. And of course, as we talked about before, you see rising Muslim populations throughout Western Europe in the form of immigrant groups. There's been a lot of both historic and modern persecution, discrimination, and conflict between Christians, Jews, and Muslims in both Europe and Russia for a long time. Moving on to ideas. Here we're going to talk about things, important cultural sort of accomplishments. Arts have always flourished throughout Europe and Russia, going back as far as ancient times. As far as literature goes, two important works out of Russia. One important work out of Russia is War and Peace, excuse me, by Tolstoy. Another important book you're familiar with is called Animal Farm by George Orwell. Art has a lot of different schools of art have flourished throughout European history. Impressionism, which you see the picture of up here. This is a depiction of it's called Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, a famous example of Impressionism. These other schools, abstract surrealism, modernism. During the Soviet era, Russia's artistic movement was strictly controlled by the government. And in that case, it was really just used to promote communist ideas and to support mostly this guy here, Joseph Stalin. Stalin was one of Russia's early dictators, and they exuded a lot of control over the country. And he used his art to cover the country in images of himself, both large and all over the place, usually depicting him as more than just a man, more than just a leader. It leads to what's called cult of personality, which is sort of a hero worship of a leader, which is carried out by the mass media. And what it does is it elevates your leader to more than just a man. He's sort of everywhere. He's sort of your father. He's your God. He's everything. Musically, a lot of famous music is going to come out of Europe and Russia. The classical stuff from historical like Beethoven, but also as the 1900s come into place, we see a lot of American influenced music, American blues and jazz influence European bands like the Beatles, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, things like that. Moving on to military, talk about conflicts, modern conflicts. Europe, like the United States, is currently engaged in trying to fight off attacks from groups like Al-Qaeda, Islamic Islamic terrorists. In 2004, there was a terrorist bomb in Spain that killed 191 people, wounded 1,800. And then 2005, Al-Qaeda terrorists bombed a subway and buses in England, killing 56 people and wounding 700. Chechnya. Chechnya is a region in southern Russia. As the different Soviet republics were breaking away, and Russia was allowing that, Chechnya saw an opportunity. Chechnya is a mostly Muslim region, and they wanted to break away from Russia and form their own country. So we call this a separatist movement. Russia refused, and what we've had is a conflict ongoing for the past almost 20 years. The Chechen wars were brutal, and after Chechnya couldn't defeat Russia militarily, they resorted to more terrorist tactics, taking hostages, excuse me, blowing up apartment buildings, suicide bombing, assassinations, more what we consider terrorist sort of strategies. Again, if you're familiar with this, of course, you remember that the 2013 Boston Marathon bombers, their motivation for attacking the people in the Boston Marathon was tied to this Chechen separatist movement. On to economic. Remember, since the 1800s, Europe is going to be an industrial, wealthy, and they're going to be building empires over the world, while Russia remains mostly agricultural and poor, with no empire outside of Eurasia, well into the middle of the 1900s. By the 1900s, Europe, by the late 1900s, so think of it like this, that Russia is always going to be like 100 or 150 years behind the rest of Europe, economically speaking. By the 1900s, they become more competitive. During the Cold War, they're trying to compete with the United States through an arms and space race, and that costs a lot of money. And that money they're spending on making weapons and trying to explore space better and faster than the U.S. Is going to cause people in what's called the Eastern Bloc, which is Russia and those Eastern European countries that used to be communist. That's going to cause them a lot of problems. They're not going to be able to get the things they need, and that's going to cause a lot of unrest. All right, as we were saying, so by trying to outspend the United States in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European communist allies are making the people suffer, not being able to get access to basic goods. Excuse me. Overall, modern Europe has moderate to high GDP, so we're talking about the value, again, of goods and services provided in that country. As you can see, the Western European countries, for the most part, have higher GDPs than Eastern and Southern Europe, and higher than Russia and the Eastern states. So you can see kind of where that Northern and Central Western Europe, that's where most of your wealth is going to be concentrated. How is that money spent? Well, if you look at sort of the image here of our social welfare systems, these are things like retirement pensions that we talked about when during the aging population trends. These could be additional income provided by the government to the poor, any kind of assistance provided by the government through tax dollars for people in need. When most of people's care is provided by the government, we call these welfare states. And you can see across here how much money is spent on social welfare programs in Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, and Russia. When we talk about where money is spent, again, Europeans tend to have fairly high incomes, maybe not as much as Americans, but pretty close. North and Western Europeans make more money than Southern and Eastern Europeans. Lots of leisure time. They usually have, very common to have 4 weeks of paid vacation, which is much more than we get here. Um, and what you see is, again, versus developed, we talked about advanced economies, high jobs, high paying jobs, high skilled jobs. Those are mostly located in Western Europe. Eastern Europe and Russia are still sort of in that transition to full developed economy status. And our last prime is social cultural. About most of the European population lives in what we call an urban setting. Very few people live in rural settings anymore. We do have a lot of diversity in Europe, however, it's a very highly educated region. Some of the highest literacy rates in the world are found in Europe and Russia. 70% of them complete high school, which is fairly high for globally. And this is going to impact daily life because people who have high levels of education tend to get jobs that are higher paying. So again, this translates back to quality of life. The quality of healthcare and the government involvement in that healthcare varies. Every country in Europe has what's called universal healthcare. That means all your medical, dental, and mental care are covered completely by insurance, which is usually supported by the government, and that gets everybody covered. So we tend to see some of the lowest infant mortality rates in the world. We also tend to see some of the highest life expectancies as well. Again, you'll see that Eastern Europe and Russia have both lower life expectancies. They also have a little bit higher infant mortality rates than the rest of Europe, and that's attributed more towards choices in sort of lifestyle or behaviors. Russia and Eastern Europe has a kind of a social issue with alcoholism and drug use, high levels of smoking, and that tends to impact the health of babies. It also impacts how long people tend to live. The last aspect of culture, of course, is what people enjoy to do, and popular sports. By far, the most popular sport in Europe is soccer, of course referred to as football over there. Now Russia, because of their climate, their shift is more towards indoor sports. So we see really popular things like hockey, figure skating, wrestling, and the martial arts and gymnastics tend to be more popular in Russia. All right, that wraps up our PRIMES presentation. Hopefully you got everything. If you missed anything, of course, you can always go back and take care of that wherever you need. Thank you.